so it's that time of year when we start to think about going back to school, and you know, we're all still young enough to be learning something. And so here we go. I wanted to give you a little pop quiz this morning to kind of keep it interesting. Pastor Mark's not here, so I can do whatever I want. Here we go. Shout out your answers, please. What year, are we ready? What year was the U.S. Bill of Rights passed by Congress? Come on, shout them out. This is audience participation. Come on. If you were here at the earlier service, Lisa Miller. All right, and what year was it? It was 1789. All right. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams died on what day? Shout out your answer. Wow, this crowd, impressive. All right, that's the right answer if you yelled July 4th. Who authored the Declaration of Independence? Willy Wonka. I didn't make sure you were reading. It's for the kids. All right, that's right, Thomas Jefferson. And what year was Labor Day declared a federal holiday? I did not know this one. Any guesses? Come on, yell out your answer. No marbles in your mouth. All right, and the answer, please? 1894. I know, right? Well, starting school can be a bit intimidating, especially if you're going to a new school this year. But you're never too old to learn or go back. So we're going to do a little bit more of refreshing with some U.S. government, a.k.a. the Bill of Rights. I'm referring to the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. First one, free speech. I can get up here and say whatever I want, and you can post nasty stuff on your Facebook, and I can block you and say stuff about you, and you can say stuff about my mom, and it's really fun, right? So that's the First Amendment. The second is freedom of the press. We can go on and on about that one. Number 3, assembly. We get together here. We have freedom of assembly, and I'm very thankful for that. Freedom of religion. I'm thankful we can gather here. There's so many countries in the world that don't have a chance to gather and have their own gathering of religion. Number 5, freedom to bear arms. Freedom of due process, meaning there's certain fair and legal processes that you have to follow to when you are going through the legal process. Number 7, a jury trial. There's countries in the world where they don't get a fair trial. Search and seizure is another one. The other one is no cruel and unusual punishment. You can't be tortured. And we are free from quartering soldiers. I'm thankful for that. But if the Bill of Rights were written today, it would look much different, okay? I'm going to insert a few things that I think we would want in our Bill of Rights, okay? Free education. Can I get an amen from anybody paying off a student loan? Right, okay. All right, teens, this one's for you. Free Wi-Fi. Yeah, I knew it. I knew Azariah would come through for me. All right. Free health care. Yeah, free health care. Freedom from government interference. Oh, yeah. I'm getting a little of that. The men who wrote the Bill of Rights knew this and accounted for it. And they had this 9th Amendment, which is basically a catch-all amendment. And let me give it to you in the paraphrase, which I learned it, because it's full of a bunch of gobbledygook language that I didn't even understand. Basically, it says this: we have the right to do what we want, when we want, as long as it doesn't interfere with someone else's personal amended rights. In other words, you can do whatever you want with whomever you want, unless it interferes with their amended rights. As Americans, we love this. It's how we think. I get to do what I want, when I want. Teens, did you ever try this with your parents? Here's the problem. If you give people rights without responsibility, things go horribly wrong. Every parent knows that with rights come responsibility, right? So, you get a driver's license. You got the right to drive. But did anybody other than me ever get the keys taken away from them? Come on, we're family. Okay, yay. There was like nobody in the first service. I was the only bad one. This happened to me, homecoming, my sophomore year. I'm in a car parade going through town mocking our rival school with the Montague Wildcat mascot hanging out the back of my station wagon, or my parents' station wagon. I think the officer who called my parents described my driving as careening, quote unquote, meaning swerving all over. All of a sudden, my right to drive was removed. But what about this one? Has anyone ever had their door removed from their bedroom, or removed their kid's door? Anybody? Okay, that didn't thank you for your honesty. All right, that didn't happen to me, but it did happen to my youngest sister, Katie, the one who was known as the queen of the double door slam. In other words, she would slam her door, and if she didn't like the way that went, then she'd open it and slam it again. So she lost her right to privacy. Liberty must be coupled with responsibility. Liberty without responsibility undermines liberty. Because liberty without taking responsibility actually creates anarchy. So why is there no bill of responsibility? Well, because the authors of the Constitution assumed moral guardrails. They used the Bible when they wrote the Constitution as a moral compass. There was an understanding of taking care of your neighbor, a consensus of conscience on what was right and what was wrong, and that God had ordained a national accountability to one another. Individual rights were always expressed with concern for everyone else around you or our wider community. This concept was greatly expressed in the preamble in the Constitution and assumed a connection between God and rights. We're accountable to God for how we express our rights. John Adams said it this way. He was against slavery, and he actually never owned a slave, but he said it like this: our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So what happens when my rights and your Ninth Amendment rights collide? Well, we let the courts decide. And after that, there's law after law, say it with me, after law, after law, after law. So many laws, because we're always looking for what? What can I get away with? The law always represents the minimum requirement. I'm only accountable to the government and to the written law. Does that all sound familiar to you? Do you kind of see that pervade our news these days? But let me tell you something. Laws do not inspire you. Laws do not inspire you. The law always calls us out rather than calling us up. Laws don't call us to freedom. There's no law that inspires you to marital faithfulness. Traffic laws don't make you a courteous driver, because anybody who's been in rush hour around here can tell you that. People don't wake up one morning and read the drinking and driving laws and say, I'm so inspired. Laws and rights promote and exercise and power, and that's what's happening in our gospel reading for today. Let's go ahead and enter into Mark 7, verses 1 through 13. One day, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. Makes me kind of wonder what they were up to. Pharisees are the kind of religious traffic cops. There were like 613 or so religious laws in that day that they had, and the Pharisees would have memorized them all. They were always looking about what people were wearing, what they were doing, how they were doing it, were they doing it in the correct order. And they're always good at noticing when people weren't following the rules. It says they noticed that some of the disciples failed to follow the Jewish ritual of hand washing before eating. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, do not eat until they've poured water over their cupped hands as required by their ancient traditions. Similarly, they don't eat anything from the market until they immerse their hands in water. But this is one of many traditions they've clung to, such as their ceremonial washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the religious law asked him, "Why don't your disciples follow our age-old traditions? They eat first without first performing the hand-washing ceremony." Can you hear what's going on here? Here's what my 21st century ears hear. What's wrong with them? Why can't they do it the right way? Why can't they be more like us? Well, Jesus replies to them. And he says, you hypocrites. Now in the Greek, the word hypocrite is the word actor. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God. It's all about keeping the rules. It's all about how it looks. I was recently talking with my mom about an issue that we were having in our family. And she said it like this, and I thought it was brilliant. It says, it's all about how if I'm standing close enough to it, I must be doing it. I used to say this back to our students back where I lived. I said, going to church doesn't make you a hamburger or a Christian any more than going to McDonald's makes you a hamburger. Jesus pulls out the trump card and says, for you ignore God's specific laws and substitute your own traditions. Then he said, you reject God's laws in order to hold on to our own traditions. For instance, Moses gave you this law from God. Honor your father and mother. And anyone who speaks evil of his father or mother must be put to death. But you say it's all right for people to say to their parents, sorry, I can't help you. For I have vowed to give to God what could have been given to you. You let them disregard their needy parents, and as such, you break the law of God to protect your own traditions. Jesus uses their teaching and he turns it upside down on them. He uses their own language to address where their hearts really are in their relationship with God and each other. He says to them basically, if you're going to follow the law, well then here's where you're missing it. It's just like Jesus to say, hey, let's go back to 1 through 10. Can you keep those? What about that number 4? How are you doing on that whole honoring your parents thing? I know you can keep the rules. I know what the law says, but how about your heart? Ultimately, they'd missed the heart of God. They'd missed the point of the freedom of the gospel. You know, I find that hiding behind the law is exhausting. When I hide behind the law, I always have to watch my angle. I always have to make sure that I've got the law to cover my back. I'm only as good as if I keep the rules. If I just stick to my rights, then I can check my conscience at the door and I don't need to think about it or wrestle with hard things or relationships. Now, a few years later, the Apostle Paul is writing to the Gentiles in a Roman province named Galatia. And there's some more confusion about keeping the Old Testament law again. Paul makes a statement which is relevant for us at LCM and how we can respond to our personal freedom and rights. Galatians 5:13 through 15 says it this way. He says, you were called to be free. You're Christians. How are you going to respond to your freedom? Let me ask you a question. How did that happen? I mean, how did you get free? Who acquired your freedom? I'll give you a little clue. It wasn't you. The Greek word for freedom is eleutheria. It's a blessing because of grace. A blessing is something that we take and we want to pass on to someone else. It's not a stick that we get to take and beat people with. The word says, do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this entire command. Love one another. We get to rise above the law because we have freedom in Jesus. Here's some examples. I'm going to respond to my husband in such a way that isn't what he deserves. I'm going to treat the older people in this church the way that I would want to be treated. I'm going to give rather than take. I'm going to treat my boss, coworker, neighbor the way I would want to be treated. And here's a question for you that reveals a heart that's free. Students, you want to change the world? You want to control your parents? Do you want to create shock and awe in your household? ask this question: how can I help? Seriously. How can I help? At LCM, we have the opportunity to ask some questions that we could be doing to help further the gospel here in this community. The first one is how can I help? How can I be part of the solution and not the problem? The first thing we could do is help make LCM the friendliest place around. I remember coming here 20 years ago one time as a college student. I remember that a couple things about this place. I remembered the way they sang the Lord's Prayer, and I remembered how friendly it was and how welcome it made me feel. Another thing you could say is, I can do that. Does somebody need help painting? Does a classroom need to be cleaned up? Do kids need to be served? Do we need people on Wednesday nights to help teach kids? Absolutely we do. How can you say, I can do that? Now, I'm not trying to guilt anyone this morning, but we have some really deep needs here in our community. When you know that 60 to 70% of the kids who come through our doors on a Wednesday night or on a Sunday morning come without their parents, I see mentoring happening. And it's just a huge thing. Number 2, do what's responsible, not just what's permissible. Do you ever have anybody go over the top for you? Do you ever have anybody who gave you just amazing service somewhere that you're just like, wow, I really needed that. Wow, that was a breath of fresh air in my life. We need people who will go over the top, not just in our kids' ministry, although we do need that, but also in our basketball ministry. Last week I had somebody email me back when I expressed a need for some male mentors in our basketball ministry. Because one, in case you haven't noticed, I'm not a man. Every Wednesday night we have 30 to 40 men show up, or 30 to 40 kids show up in our basketball ministry. And I am not a man, and I am not African American, in case you haven't noticed that either. And I can help, but I'll tell you, there's some impact there that could be made by some men, and it would be amazing. The third one is join our Be Our Guest team and make LCM the friendliest place to be, or just help serve in a kids ministry, or just come into the office and say, what could I do? And the third one is to honor God. What would be honoring to God? You know, really intuitively, you know the answer to that already. It's in the preamble. We hold these truths